They got the license, and a few months later, Hoskins and Griffiths published their paper showing that there was an active earthquake fault called the Hosgri Fault just offshore, capable of an earthquake far larger than the plant was designed to withstand.
Ukraine was in line with those protests that were unleashed after the 2008 financial economic crisis.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We record a few days before Labor Day. I remember when Labor Day was once celebrated by unions going out in parade to show off their power. Now we're lucky if we see a few firefighters and their engines. Anyway, I want to talk about noise. I saw some workers recently with gas-powered leaf blowers. No ear protection and 90 decibels of sound grinding away at their eardrums. It shouldn't be allowed. Not only should they get comfortable ear protection, but the gas-powered equipment should be replaced with electric equipment, which is 10 times quieter. That's my Labor Day thought. Now, 20 seconds or so of dramatic footage of a river in flood in Pakistan. That video came from the Twitter account of Taj Ali. Now, Amy Goodman explains about the flood situation in Pakistan on Democracy Now!
The World Health Organization warns catastrophic flooding in Pakistan has left more than 3 million children in need of humanitarian assistance and at increased risk of disease, drowning, and malnutrition. The WHO has declared the flooding a Grade 3 emergency, its highest level. New satellite images show how unprecedented monsoon rains have created a 60-mile-wide inland lake around the overflowing Indus River, leaving a huge swath of Pakistan underwater.
These before and after pictures show the enormity of the flooding in Pakistan. Now to the nuclear situation in Ukraine.
Engineers at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant have ordered an emergency shutdown of a nuclear reactor amidst reports of intense artillery fire near the site. Just one of the plant's 6 nuclear reactors is now operating. Ukraine's state-owned energy company says shelling also damaged a power supply, forcing one of the plant's reactors to rely on a diesel backup to prevent a catastrophic release of radiation.
I'm Lynn.
Ukraine isn't the only area with nuclear problems. Astoundingly, the governor of California panicked legislators by telling them that electricity could possibly run out. So the legislature of California, Democrats and Republicans, joined together to reverse the decision to close down the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant and give the aging plant 5 more years of service. The day before the vote, there was a press conference in California, and we'll show parts of it.
Beth Seeley from San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace, and we've been fighting Diablo Canyon since 1973. And our chief concerns are safety and the environment. And this bill just devastates both of the major concerns that we have. And we're also concerned about the solar, the terrible damage it does to the solar industry and to rooftop solar in our state. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is this alleged 5-year extension of the license to operate. That's in the bill, but PG&E has stated publicly at the Diablo Canyon Decommissioning Engagement Panel that they will apply for a 20-year license extension. It only makes sense for them to apply for 20 years. That's how long license extensions are with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And that, I want to remind everybody about the 2016 agreement when we had a final date for the shutdown of Diablo Canyon, which was going to be in 2024 and 2025, that we were resting assured with that. So I just want to remind everybody that there is no assurance that this bill is going to stop Diablo Canyon after 5 years. And if you believe what they say, then you have definitely drunk the Kool-Aid. Also, this bill, SB 846, categorically exempts from CEQA, which is California Environmental Quality Act, the Diablo Canyon Power Plant site, all structures, buildings, and equipment necessary to extend operations. That includes the embrittled reactor vessel. The reactor vessel is the place where the nuclear reaction takes place. And that reactor vessel, which Arnie Gunderson is going to talk about later on today, is embrittled. And he'll tell you what that means. We have, on the decommissioning panel, one of our members has requested from PG&E about the details of the embrittled reactor vessel. PG&E wrote back this morning and said that that is proprietary information, refusing to give it to the panel member. We consulted with one of the retired NRC commissioners who says that's absolutely untrue. It is not proprietary information. And three other nuclear engineers who also say it's not proprietary information. So this embrittled reactor vessel is one of the most important, not important, I mean, lethal things that could happen to the whole state of California. And they want to keep it running for another 5 to 20 years. Okay, so another part of this bill is that under SB 846, PG&E could mismanage the plant, even commit gross negligence, and still be held harmless against any of the outcomes. And at the same time, the shareholders will get record profits. I mean, what a sweet deal for PG&E. It's almost incomprehensible that this is possibly going to pass. We already have over 3.5 million pounds of highly radioactive nuclear waste at the site. It's stored both in the spent fuel pools and in the dry cask storage adjacent to the plant. When you look at the place where the dry cask storage is, it's on these pads, concrete pads that are 7.5 feet thick. There is exactly enough space on those concrete pads to hold the waste that's going to be created through 2025. So if this plant stays in operation, that means that the spent fuel pools are going to get more and more and more loaded with this highly radioactive, the most toxic substance that's ever been created on the face of the earth, built on at least 4 earthquake faults, really 13 earthquake faults, but who's counting? To go on for an undetermined amount of time.
The governor put into print at 7:56 on Sunday night a bill to extend the life of the aging and decrepit Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. He did that because the Constitution requires 3 days advance notice before there can be a vote. And this was to be jammed through so that there could be almost no scrutiny of such an extraordinarily, potentially catastrophic action. I want to explain for a moment why it is so monumental, what's at stake, and I'll do a bit of screen sharing in a moment. Inside each of the reactors at Diablo Canyon, there is the equivalent of 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb. In technical terms, there are about 15 billion curies of radioactivity inside each reactor, meaning that there are about 500 billion emissions of radiation a second. The only way that that public is protected is if that radioactivity stays inside the core. The only way that happens is if it's constantly cooled. So if an earthquake occurs, if there is sabotage or a terrorist attack, if a worker makes the wrong decision, we can have a release of an extraordinary amount of radioactivity. Essentially a Fukushima on the California coast, but unlike Fukushima where the wind blew most of the radioactivity out to sea, the winds would bring the radioactivity inland to Central Valley or to Southern California or Northern California, depending on which way the wind blows. So let me show you what's at stake, if I can, for a moment. We can do screen sharing. And Diablo was built based on PG&E's assertion that there were no active earthquake faults within about 30 kilometers of the site. The local community group that intervened wanted to put on an expert witness in the hearings to demonstrate that there were faults nearby, and PG&E in its wisdom objected, and the licensing board voted 2-1 to prohibit that testimony. They got the license, and a few months later, Hoskins and Griffiths published their paper showing that there was an active earthquake fault called the Hosgri fault just offshore, capable of an earthquake far larger than the plant was designed to withstand. PG&E initially denied it and eventually had to admit to it, but by that time, 80% of the plant was completed. And rather than upgrade the plant or abandon it, they just asked the NRC essentially for a waiver to allow the plant to be built with an exception for the Hosgri fault. That, by a vote of 3-2, was allowed by the NRC. Two courageous commissioners, Victor Galinsky and Peter Bradford, objected. If there had been one more vote, there would not have been the Diablo Canyon plant built at all. But PG&E said, don't worry, there won't be any more faults found. But then the San Luis Bay fault was discovered nearby, and the Osas fault was discovered nearby. And then most troubling, the shoreline fault was discovered, which is within 600 meters of the plant and about 300 meters from the plant intakes. And these faults are capable of earthquakes larger than the plant was designed to withstand. It gets worse. PG&E claimed that there were no connections between these faults, that the faults are connected. The longer the fault, generally the more earthquake shaking can occur. They said there were no connections, but then they had to admit that the Hosgri was connected to a nearby fault. And then they, sorry, it's not moving, there we go. Then they claimed that the Hosgri and the San Simeon faults weren't connected. And then they had to admit that they were Hosgri, San Simeon, and San Gregorio faults connected. And finally, they now had to admit that there could be a joint rupture along the Hosgri, San Simeon, San Gregorio fault zone, which runs from south of the reactors to north of San Francisco. So they began with the claim of no active faults within 30 kilometers and no interconnections. And now it's known that there are 4 nearby faults and several interconnections. I stop sharing. PG&E testified on Thursday and Friday before the legislature that don't worry, there is a resident NRC inspector on site, and if it were unsafe, they would shut it down. But the senior resident inspector at the time, Dr. Michael Peck, indeed concluded it was unsafe, violating its license and should be shut down. And rather than shutting it down, the NRC transferred him back east. So we have the toothless regulator and a criminal utility, one that's been found guilty of numerous crimes that have resulted in numerous deaths. And you know that, for example, Judge Alsop, who oversaw PG&E's handling of safety issues, said, in these 5 years, PG&E has been on a crime spree and will emerge from probation as a continuing menace to California. And even Governor Newsom, as recently as 2019 in the New York Times said about PG&E, they have simply been caught red-handed over and over again, lying, manipulating, or misleading the public. So you have a terribly dangerous mix. 15 billion curies of radioactivity in each reactor, the ability for that to get released if there's a loss of cooling resulting in melting, a criminal utility that really doesn't want this facility license extended and is being pressured into it. So a mix of an incompetent and reluctant utility and the most dangerous energy technology on Earth is a very, very toxic mix.
In Saudi Arabia, a woman's been sentenced to 45 years in prison for her social media posts. A Saudi terrorism court convicted Noura al-Qahtani of, quote, using the internet to tear the social fabric and violating public order by using social media, unquote. This comes just weeks after a Saudi court sentenced women's rights defender Salma al-Shahab to 34 years in prison over her Twitter posts. In the occupied West Bank, a 40-year-old Palestinian prisoner has ended a hunger strike that saw him subsist on only water for over 170 days. Khalil al-Wawda said Wednesday he would break his fast after Israeli officials agreed to release him in October. He's been held without charge by Israel under its so-called administrative detention program since his arrest late last year. Awalda lost over 100 pounds. His family says the hunger strike nearly killed him. He looked emaciated and frail as he spoke from a hospital bed Wednesday.
I will remain in the hospital until I recover and be able to stand up and walk again. This victory is a continuation of the victories that our Palestinian people have achieved.
Now, more of my interview with Dennis Pilash about Ukraine in 2014. Last week, he had been talking about the killing of 90 protesters in the Maidan, including a pacifist he knew named Serhiy Kemsky. So you have all these crowds and protests, and the government says it's going to stop, and then it turns violent, and then there's this last spasm by the government. 90 people or so are killed. I assume many were injured too. And then it all fell apart for the government. Is that right?
Yeah, and it fell apart very, very miserably. So President Yanukovych, again, it's often when you see these narratives from those skeptical about Maidan protests, so they will emphasize that he was a legitimate president and so on. But actually, he when in power, he extended his powers, and he actually reversed the constitutional reform in Ukraine that gave more powers to the parliament than to the president, because originally President Kuchma, who was actual architect of Ukrainian oligarchy capitalism, he made very, very vast presidential powers for himself. And then already during the first Maidan in 2004, then there was agreed that will be this transition of some powers to the parliament, but actually Yanukovych concentrated more powers in his hands, and he was acting in a way that he was monopolizing that power that broke this fragile hybrid oligarchical semi-democratic system in Ukraine, and that was leading to a more authoritarian type of oligarchy from this more or less electoral authoritarian model. So Yanukovych, he when everything fell apart, even at the stage when it wasn't yet decided, but he fled with his vast wealth. So it was they were packing lots of lorries, I don't know, cars with different fancy stuff. And so he fled from his one of his residences that then was turned into almost an amusement park, because it's so large, and he had ostriches there, and different type of exotic, I know, animals and stuff and so on. And then he fled from Kiev, and ultimately very soon he fled from Ukraine, and this also gave this starting point for Putin's administration in Russia to start its own game against Ukrainian territorial integrity.
Maybe we'll get into that in another interview. But so where were you at this point when Yanukovych fled? Were you living in Maidan or going there, or how was it for you personally?
At that point, though I was for more than a month, I was living near Maidan, but at that point I was in my native city, and I was following all this from a distance with utter horror, like with this online doom watching the TV.
Right.
What's going on.
So in summing up, what would you say to those who ignore this vast process of masses in action and say this U.S. official, Victoria Nuland, worked with the Ukrainian far right, and this is what overthrew the government?
You see, what happened in Ukraine wasn't unique to Ukraine, and it wasn't really something staged up. If you look for a literal coup, so yes, you have a lots of examples, be it Guatemala in 1954, or almost the same time in Iran against Mossadegh. But it was like a literal coup with a small number of people who undermine the regime that enjoys huge popularity. And at the same time, Ukraine was in line with those protests that were unleashed after the 2008 financial economic crisis throughout the world, the crisis of the global capitalism, when actually in every country you see a different set of prerequisites, different triggers that started the protests. But you see many similarities. I think that Cihan Tugal, who is a Turkish sociologist, he did a frame for this so-called uprisings like throughout the world that were based in this end of like previous commodities boom and in the economic crisis of capitalism that was aggravating all these inequalities, all the injustices that exist. So you have the Arab Springs, you have the Taksim Square protest in Turkey, you have the square movements throughout Europe, like from Sintagma in Greece to Indignados and M18 movement in Spain, the uprising or protests in Iceland, in Reykjavik. You have Occupy Wall Street and everything that was brought after the Occupy Wall Street. So you have all of these are very specific, and sometimes and they are very complex, and you have different forces that join these protests. You have different maybe percentage of more progressive and more reactionary forces that try to infiltrate them. But still, the pattern is more or less the same. So you cannot stage up a protest that is supported by millions of people by some special services, by some intelligence meddling and so on. You have millions of people with legitimate grievances, with driven by their feeling of insecurity, by their feeling of enormous inequality existing in the society, by their feeling of lack of political representation, by their feeling of being suppressed by the police state, and so on and so on. So at a very basic level, I think that almost any protester throughout the world could understand this internal grievance that was moving the protest.
And finally, this gutsy act of kindness, the rescue of a cat during the raging floods in Pakistan. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.